She is an ethnographer, strategist, and facilitator specializing in actionable wisdom through immersive fieldwork. Director of Strategy at SubRosa, please welcome Karen Faith.
This is the very first picture of a black hole. It was taken, made possible by the work of Katie Bowman when she was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT this spring. But she didn't take that picture, nor did she create it by herself. In fact, this image represents data taken from radio observatories all over the globe and represents a ridiculous amount of data, 5 petabytes, which is 5 million gigabytes, which if you were to try to store it on the iPhone 11 at max capacity would take 19,531 of them. As it turned out, it was stored on over 1,000 hard drives. Those hard drives were shipped to and from observatories in Hawaii, Chile, Arizona, Mexico, Spain, and Antarctica. Because this image isn't visible from any one place on Earth. It's only possible by connecting the images, the perspectives of others viewing from where they are, right? My name is Karen. I'm the Director of Strategy and Training at SubRosa, which is a design agency in New York City. I'm an ethnographer, strategist, and writer specializing in empathy practice, which means that I spend a lot of time with people one-on-one in the context of their lives. Here is me creeping on a guy at his job. And here's me interviewing a bike shop owner about the way that he uses Google Maps. So Google wanted us to send a survey to small business owners to find out how they're using the tools, but I hate surveys. So I got them to let me interview people one-on-one. I spent the whole day with him, doing as he did, hanging up bike tires, and we ended up having a really interesting conversation about government surveillance, which changed the direction of the project around data and privacy. That's a result we never could have come to if I would have sent him a multiple choice form. So this is why, whenever possible, I try to be with people in their context, speaking to them intimately, one-on-one, which is hard sometimes, like when I had to interview Brian, the beekeeper. So in a nutshell, I practice qualitative, immersive, intimate research. I've long been allergic to surveys. I oppose research at scale, and I've refused to use personas because I have long believed that no one should ever be made into a type or a caricature. Little foreshadowing on that. So recently, I had occasion to think of design thinking in a new light when a friend of mine asked me what it was, and I found myself blurt out, "It's basically the scientific method, but with better branding." Once I said it, I decided to research it. Questionable order of operations, I admit. But when I researched it, I found something really interesting. Every step of the design thinking process seemed to reflect one of its alleged predecessor. So making an observation and empathizing amount to generating a seminal insight from which to begin. Asking a question and defining are factually the same. As you know, in design thinking, when we define a challenge, we often start by formulating a how might we statement. Creating a hypothesis and ideation do have some nuanced differences, but they amount to figuring out what we think is going on and how we might respond to it. Conducting an experiment is prototyping, and testing is the way that we draw conclusions. So for all it's worth, there are several different variations of design thinking and the scientific method, some of which have up to 8 steps. I'm using the simplest ones here, because otherwise I don't get to say what I'm about to say. So when comparing the 2 sequences side by side, 2 differences beamed at me. First of all, design thinking seems to be missing a step. More on that later. And secondly, that first step is the whole game. Making an observation begins with my own perspective. When I start with empathy, I borrow someone else's. That empathetic shift of perspective makes or breaks every step that follows. When we add empathy to our processes, it impacts user experience, communication strategy, customer service, trend analysis, everything. Every other thing. There's nothing that we do that empathy doesn't change. So we often think of empathy as a feeling of compassion for someone who's suffering. But what we know as designers that suffering is not the only experience we need to understand. We also need to know what makes people feel confident, what makes them feel joyful, what makes them feel able to take a risk or to do something positive, to make a change. We need to know about so many more experiences than suffering, which is why empathy isn't about feeling, it's about doing. Many of us were taught to be empathetic in this way, the golden rule, to treat others as we want to be treated. And the spirit of the instruction is golden, but it's wrong. It assumes that we're the same, that you want for you what I want for me. And we are not the same. I do not want what you want, and I'm pretty sure you don't want what I want. In order to understand how another person wants to be treated, we have to practice empathy. What I meant, what I said, what you heard, and what you understood are 4 different things. In a very good communication, they're similar things. In a bad communication, they can be worlds apart. A lot of us can think of a time that someone misunderstood or mistranslated something that we'd said, but think of all the times they simply didn't hear you correctly. So just last week, I found myself on a difficult call with an unhappy client. So this, what you understood, was already biased to the negative. The challenges of the project were common ones, but they had reached a height for reasons that I felt were a lack of empathy. So I wanted to do a better job of it, but we were on speakerphone on both ends, so the sound quality was terrible, and everyone was pretty much yelling into the air. What you heard was distorted. I was leading the call, and I was growing really anxious with every communication fail. And at some point, I just broke. My pulse shot up, my breath shortened, I stopped thinking of words, I couldn't finish sentences. What I said was messed up at that point. Now, those of you who've had that experience know that what was happening is I was having a panic attack, which is a perfectly common experience until you're having one, and then it feels like a very freaky emergency. But I got through the call with the help of a colleague and some deep breathing. And afterwards, I tried to look and see what happened, what went wrong. And I realized that my intentions for the call were a little unbalanced. I didn't just want the call to succeed. I wanted to rebuild the client relationship, come through for my colleagues, revolutionize the way meetings are conducted at my workplace, and develop lasting bonds with everyone involved. No joke. And no wonder I panicked. To close the gap between what I meant and what you understood takes some doing. And first, we have to understand context. A person's climate and weather. So a person's climate is their baseline way of being. This is their everyday way that they are. Some people might call it their personality. Some people might refer to their Myers-Briggs or something that they think represents who they usually are. While their weather represents how they are under certain circumstances, when something is happening. I have a very loud uncle. He's loud all the time. He's so loud so often that none of us in the family notice it at all. But when he goes shopping, the cashier will feel yelled at because she's not used to it. However, I have a very quiet friend, and when she gets loud, I know that something's happened. She's gotten in a fight with her boyfriend, or she's had 3 shots of whiskey, but whatever it is, there's been a change. That's her weather. Understanding the difference between a person's climate and their weather takes time. And we don't always have that time, particularly as researchers. And so the very best thing that we can do is acknowledge that we may not know. We may not know what represents a person's baseline and what represents their behavior under the circumstances. Who here feels very close to their climate today? This is how you usually are. You feel totally regular. A couple lucky ones. And who feels very far away? You feel like this is a weird situation. Yeah, you don't recognize yourself. I can relate to you, standing up here right now. So at SubRosa, we practice a methodology called Applied Empathy, developed by our CEO and founder, Michael Ventura. Applied Empathy is a methodology based on taking human-centeredness to the next level, right? And that next level, funny enough, is right here. Self-knowledge. We start with the whole self. We believe that every person is a whole world, and that in order to understand the other worlds around us, we must first understand the place from which we are viewing and interacting with those worlds. Where the scientific method gave us reason, design thinking added empathy, and what applied empathy does is add self-knowledge to the design process. We begin with self-knowledge so that we can understand where are our biases, where are our blind spots. To that end, we use a tool we call the 7 empathic archetypes. So these are informed by classical perspectives, but are basically composed empirically from SubRosa's whole person research. These archetypes define 7 modes of being. They're not personalities. They sound like personalities. They're not personalities. They're like gears. You can think of them as gears that you can shift in between. All of us are capable of shifting in between all of these different archetypes at any time. Most of us have a favorite gear or two, but we like to try to balance ourselves by gaining skill in those areas where we might not feel as accomplished. I'm going to walk you through them because it's kind of fun. The sage's gift is to be fully in the moment, to be totally present. Folks who are often in sage mode might have heightened sensory awareness. They may be very sensitive to the sights and sounds. They are maybe preoccupied with their physical comfort or pleasure. They're not very good planners, and they don't ruminate on the past. Sages can seem flighty for that reason, but there is a deep wisdom only available in the present moment that is often available to sages. The inquirer is the question asker. This is everyone's inner 3-year-old, the one who always asks why, always has a follow-up question, always wants to know more. Inquirers, when they go on a Google search, they get lost for 3 hours and don't regret it. They may make some people uncomfortable by asking questions they don't want to ask or don't want to answer, but those who don't get uncomfortable usually make friends pretty fast. The inquirer is 1 part reporter, 1 part therapist, and they find out a lot of what we can't otherwise know. The convener is the host, special to me. I'm from southern Mississippi in the United States, and we value hosting very, very importantly. The host makes sure that they bring people together and try to anticipate their needs, to think of what they might need before they do. Hosts are great at anticipating needs, but also they're great at making people feel that they belong, even when they themselves don't often feel they belong. This is a special quality of the convener. The confidant is the classic introvert. Confidants are very, very quiet, and for that reason, they are often told secrets, even against their will. You might be a confidant if people just tell you things and you don't know why. The reason they're telling you is because they know you won't talk. Confidants regard violation of privacy to be a very serious offense. They are trustworthy, and they don't need a lot of attention. They are very, very valuable for those special covenantal matters. The cultivator is characterized by patience. Cultivators engage and invest in relationships little by little over time without immediate reward. Cultivators go to networking events without a specific goal. Cultivators also nurture people from whom they don't really necessarily need much or don't know what they might get out of that relationship. Cultivators are, I often call, the adult in the room, which is a nice person to have on occasion. The seeker, on the other hand, is the risk taker, the daring, brave one that does crazy stuff. Seekers have a lot of scars with good stories. They do things that a lot of us are afraid to do, and they do so with passion and joy. They're driven by forces that are much sturdier and stronger than their roller coasters may make them seem. The seeker is the one that can take a leap. And the alchemist is all the seeker with none of the feeling. Alchemists are testers, they're prototypers, they're tinkerers. Alchemist homes are full of gadgets and unfinished projects. They're just trying things out, and they're not necessarily happier to succeed than they are to fail. They're not emotionally invested in what they're doing at all. They're just trying things out for the sake of curiosity, but they do take those leaps little at a time. How many of you felt aligned with one of those as your climate or your baseline way of being? Yeah. Or 2, 1 or 2 maybe, yeah. how many of you noticed that you could see that you behave in one of those, in all of those ways sometimes? Sometimes, on occasion, they come around. When I came to SubRosa and began to familiarize myself with the archetypes, I felt the most connected to the convener. I enjoy hosting and preparing and presenting experiences for other people, and I take care to be sure that everyone's emotional needs are met. This is why I freaked out on that call. It's also why I've refused to do surveys, profile people, or do research at scale. But as we know, the gods have a sense of humor. So on my very first day at SubRosa, I was invited to create a survey tool profiling people by their archetype that would be administered at scale. This is my new passion project, and the prototype is ready if anyone wants to take it afterwards. But this was a new tool to me for a lot of reasons, but it also gave us a way of measuring the variables of others so that we might understand how they work and how they interact. The archetypes aren't, again, types of personality, but they're ways of interacting with people. They're different modes of interaction that we can use to practice empathy. Thank you, Manu. So I laughed when I got this assignment, and then I started. Can we go back one slide on the speaker notes? Thank you. So nearly immediately, I started writing, and I was writing these survey questions, and of course, I'm writing questions which would identify these characteristics. I find it very easy to write questions for the convener, and very interesting to write questions for the confidant, but I found myself judging the alchemist. I couldn't quite get it right, and one reason is that you cannot practice empathy and judgment at the same time. You can make a note of that. It's impossible to empathize and to judge at the same time. So my first drafts of the interview question, or the survey questions, were reflective of my judgment. It doesn't bother me to upset people. I thought the alchemist was a cold and uncaring person that didn't care about their relationships at all. I thought, how can you engage with people if you're not emotionally invested? Relationships are just experiments, agree, neutral, or disagree. And finally, I should be better at making amends, considering how often I need to do it. So I did my best to limit my bias, and I didn't think much more about it until after that weird call last week. I started thinking about what went wrong. I reviewed the triggers that brought on my anxiety and the project realities that needed to be addressed, and I asked myself, what did I need to do? And I recalled the words of a friend of mine who often advises me to give 60% less of a shit about things, and it felt relevant. I thought emotional distance would have done me a lot of good on that call. If I had been able to address things with less emotional investment in the outcome, I could have probably handled better. Just 3 days later, that project heated up again, and there was another call, and I was better equipped. I came to the call with less expectation, and I tried on the point of view of the alchemist, and it was a test. It was an experiment, because I'd never done it before. And that coolness wasn't miraculous, but it did help. And then I had an additional tool in my tool belt. Now I had another possible option to choose to engage with someone, and it was easier. It allowed me to better hear and respond to another person. So, in short, practicing self-knowledge increased my ability to relate to another person. It expanded my tool set. It allowed me to get a better outcome from the call and to move the project forward. So, as fine a process evolution as I can imagine. But let's revisit our first draft. Recall that it seemed to be one step missing when we moved from the scientific method to design thinking. Reporting results. So science and design are not trying to do the same thing, granted. But I wondered what might be the parallel of reporting results. Reporting results of our research and experimentation is the way that we contribute to the forward movement of our discipline, our community, and to civilization at large. And a lot of people already do this. A lot of people in arts and business and design are already doing this, and the open source movement has taken it really far. And the best of them would tell you that they wouldn't work any other way. Collaboration is more than just a feel-good gesture to boost morale. It's the way that we fill in the inevitable, undeniable gaps in our understanding created by our bias. This idea of filling in those gaps was very literally demonstrated by the output of the Event Horizon Telescope. I love this image not just because it looks like a glowing donut, but because it looks like an eye or an aperture. And it reminds me of what we're doing here, collecting the perspectives of others so that we might build a vision greater than we could ever imagine on our own. 3 months ago, thinking that I had no use for types or surveys, my aperture was much smaller than it is now, passionately engaged in creating this typing tool to assess archetypes. The tool works by offering me a measurement of my variables that I can adjust as I wish or correct as I need, just like the Event Horizon telescopes had to have been calibrated, I thought. But I wasn't sure, and I got curious, so I did a little digging. How were they calibrated? And if they weren't all the same type of telescope, and probably they weren't, how did they share data? Do telescopes have languages? What does telescope empathy look like? So I did some research, or I put on my Inquirer hat, and I found something wonderful. The telescopes that created this image are not all the same type of telescope, just like we're not all the same type of people. But what's more, they're not even all single telescopes. Some of them are arrays of telescopes that constantly reconfigure their arrangement in order to adjust their input and output, right? I'm going to say that again. They are arrays of telescopes that constantly adjust their configuration in order to adjust their input and output. This was amazing to me. This is the Very Large Array west of Socorro, New Mexico. And this is the Submillimeter Array located in Mauna Kea Observatory in Hawaii. And this is the ALMA. Oh, I really want my notes for this one because it has details in it. Can they come back? They're coming back. The ALMA is the Atacama Large Millimeter Array in northern Chile. So the ALMA is composed of 66 high-precision antennas, which can be moved across the desert plateau over 150 meters to 16 kilometers, giving it a powerful capacity to zoom. So larger fields can be viewed by using smaller antennas, and then moving them closer together can image areas of larger angular extent. And all of this is only possible because of the multiple telescope dishes that there are that make up the array. So when we work with the archetypes as an interior array, we allow ourselves the capacity to adjust our configuration in order to adapt to the needs of those around us. Yeah. Design thinking's main evolution was to include the perspectives of others. And in doing so, we've been able to create multifaceted, complex images and portraits of our users and audiences. But even at their best, they're contaminated by our biases and difference, the different types of telescopes that we are. And where science acknowledges this, applied empathy leans in, amplifying those differences by illuminating the multiplicity of selves within us. We are, at each of us, so full of difference, mercurial and faulty, unbalanced to begin with, and ever-changing besides. When I think about using these archetypes in the same way that the array is used, I imagine us filling in the gaps of our perspective so that we might better understand one another. My alchemist sees and understands you differently than my convener. Your seeker may respond to me more powerfully than your sage. I encourage you as image makers and empathy practitioners and interpreters of the worlds around and inside of you to deeply invest in the practice of self-knowledge. When we know who and how we are, our understanding of one another opens the door to discoveries so extraordinary we can never imagine. Thank you.